Yes. Something happened with the camera again.
There we go.
Yes.
All right, we're back.
Yes, please unmute. Great.
You're on mute.
No, I should be off.
Good. All right.
Great.
All right, folks, thank you very much. I hope we can get through this with no more technical difficulties. I'll dispense with introductions. I believe Stephanie has indicated she's taken care of that. So let me jump right in. I think I do need to identify the following. I am a critic of capitalism. I think the human race can and should do better. And I put those cards on the table so you have a clear sense of where I'm coming from. I would hope that all of the economists you encounter in your lifetime would equally put their respective cards on the table. But having been a professor of economics all my life, I can assure you that most of them won't. So let me begin from having told you where I'm coming from to talk about the ideologies of capitalism by starting with a simple reality. Capitalism is one of a variety of different ways of organizing economies. And by that, I simply mean organizing how we go about producing goods and services and distributing them amongst us as people living in communities. Every community of human beings has to do that one way or another. It has to organize the production of food, clothing, shelter, and pretty much everything else that folks consume. And then it has to work out some way to get the products from the producer into the hands of the consumer. Those two functions, production and distribution, are common to all economic systems that we know of, but pretty much the rest of it, how they go about it, is extremely variable. And that's what I want to stress here at the beginning. I'll very briefly go through some of the variations, but before I do, I want you to be clear that every single way of organizing the production and distribution of goods in human communities has involved people who are very satisfied and happy with that particular way of doing it, and likewise people who are critical, don't like it, and think and work to make a change to a better system. We have not always done it in the same way. Because of time limits, let me be very brief. In the history of the human race, for example, there have been long periods of time when individuals who did the production also distributed to themselves. In other words, we lived in communities of more or less self-sufficient farmers, self-sufficient craftspersons, who pretty much did most of the production, food, clothing, shelter, and distributed the products to themselves and survived in that way. That's one way of doing it. And there are still, around the world today, communities of people who live in that way of organizing production and distribution. Here's another way. You organize a village, a community of a few dozen, a few hundred, a few thousand. It varies. And you have something called the division of labor. In other words, one person bakes the bread, another person makes the pots, still another family makes shoes. And therefore, when you have a division of labor, you have to work out some method of distributing. Everybody gets bread, but only a few people make it. Everybody wears shoes, but only a few people make them, and so on. And then the human race has developed a whole host of ways of distributing goods and services when there is a division of labor. Again, a few examples. One way of organizing this has the name slavery. Kind of interesting. A very small number of people are masters, and the vast majority of people are slaves. The masters own the slaves. They are property. The slaves do the work, using their brains and muscles to transform nature into finished products, and the slaves distribute those products both to one another, the consumption of the slaves, and to the masters, the consumption of the masters. This is all under the control of the masters. A tiny minority of the population runs the show. Were there people who liked slavery? You bet. Whether it was in the American South before the Civil War, or in ancient Greece, or in Rome, or in 100 other examples, in slave systems, there were those who liked it, and there were those who didn't. It probably will come to you as no great surprise that the masters tended to like it, and the slaves tended to be the more critical. That should not come as a major surprise, especially for those of you familiar with American history. Here's another arrangement: feudalism. There we have a small number of people called lords. I'm using European feudalism as my example, but feudalism has existed all over the place. The vast majority of people in feudalism were called serfs. This was not slavery because the serfs were not the property of the lords. They were, if you like, free. That is, they were no one else's property. They tended to go with the land upon which they were born, but that was a different relationship than one to another person as your owner. How was the production and distribution of goods organized, either on a slave plantation or on a feudal plantation, for lack of a better term? The Lord took care of that. The Lord decided who got what, how much the Lord got out of the output, how much the serfs could get to keep. That was all arranged by the Lord. For most of the histories of slavery and feudalism, some portion of the output was distributed by means of an odd institution. That institution is called the market. For most of the history of the human race, markets were not used to distribute goods and services. They were used marginally in slavery and feudalism. Markets become particularly important in capitalism, which is still another arrangement radically different from every other one I've just mentioned. Here's how capitalism works, and here's what defines it. It is like slavery and feudalism in the following way. A tiny proportion of the population owns and operates, runs and controls production and distribution. If you add up all of the people in that position in capitalism, and they have a name, the name is employer. The employers run the production and distribution. They own and operate the factories, the stores, and the offices in which production and distribution is organized. The vast majority of people are employees, not employers. Just like the majority in slavery are slaves and the majority in feudalism are serfs, the majority in capitalism are employees. So that's quite similar. Here's a difference. In order for the employee to go to work, a deal has to be struck, literally an exchange. in the market. The worker, the employee, sells his or her ability to work to the employer for an agreed upon amount of money. We usually call that a wage. The employee says, if you give me a wage Friday afternoon, I will come from Monday through Friday from 8 to 5, and I will do whatever you tell me to do up to a point between 8 and 5. I will use my brains and muscles in a way we will agree upon. And everything that I produce with my brains and my muscles will instantaneously, when I'm done producing it, belong to you, the employer. My job will be to go home at the end of each day, grab a beer and a slice of pizza, and go to sleep so I can come back the next day and do it all again. You, the employer, get all of the output. At the end of Friday, you give me a wage. If what I produce for you is worth more than the wage you paid me, and is worth more than the tools and equipment I used, that extra belongs to you, the employer. Notice with me, please, so you can see where I'm going, that this capitalist system is extraordinarily undemocratic. The employer is not someone over whom you have authority. The employer can tell you on a given Friday afternoon, don't come back Monday morning, you're fired. The employer can take from you your job, your income, your self-esteem, pretty much whatever he, she wants. Your recourse is to go, leave, and go find another employer with whom to cut the same basic deal. You do not vote for the employers. You don't vote them in, and you don't vote them out. You do what you are told when you cross the threshold into your job. You are not the property of your employer. That would be slavery. You are not the serf of your lord. That would be feudalism. You are the employee of the employers. And as I say, employers, say in the United States, are 1, maybe 2% of the population, and the employees are all the rest. Now let's turn to how capitalism is distinctive and how ideologies have evolved around that distinction. Because of the way capitalism is organized, as I've just told you, it has certain properties. And it has had these properties for the last 300 years in every part of the world where capitalism has settled in to be the dominant system. In general, we refer to the origins of what we now call capitalism as somewhere in England around the 17th, maybe early 18th century. And from there, it spread to Northern and Western Europe, and then to North America, Japan, and now it is pretty much a global system. Over that time, a lot of people have worked to provide a celebration of capitalism, to appreciate it. In their enthusiasm, some of them have gone so far as to imagine that capitalism has always existed, even though that is historically not the case. In their enthusiasm, they have often thought that capitalism is some kind of end of history, that whereas every other system we know of has the following pattern: it was born out of other systems. It evolved over time, and then it died. This is a hard object lesson for people who live in capitalism, because the prospect of it having been born, well, that's clearly established. And the fact that it has evolved over time, that's pretty clearly established. And if you get that, well, then you know what the next stage might well be, which is that it dies. And if you're living in capitalism and its next stage is to pass away, this might cause you some distress. And so ideologies, thought patterns, which is all ideology is, thought patterns developed that said, no, no, this won't go away. Capitalism is somehow perpetual, universal. It has that kind of property, which, again, no other economic system ever had. And so the burden would be more on those of you who might think or want to think that it will last forever. But for the rest of you, the thought would have to occur, gee, might it be like all the others? And if so, then the question becomes, when is the decline happening? Or the perhaps even more arresting question, is it happening now? Let me look at capitalism a little more with you. And again, to remind you, so that my cards are on the table, I am a critic of capitalism. I believe that the system can be changed and that we can and should do better. One of the things that's remarkable about capitalism, and here I speak to you because we're in the United States, and what I'm about to tell you is particularly strong here, although not unique. One of the things capitalism does is produce extraordinary inequality. This is not new. Capitalism has always produced inequality. A recent book by a fairly well-known French economist named Thomas Piketty, called Capitalism in the 21st Century, will take you through, in its 600 plus pages, the long, complex history of capitalisms all over the place and the inequality that they have produced. If you want, we can go into some of the statistics. They are remarkable, particularly for the United States today. They're exemplified, of course, by the Elon Musk that we referred to as we were tinkering with the technology a few minutes ago, by Jeffrey Bezos and those kinds of folks, by the fact that for the last 30 to 40 years, the overwhelming bulk of wealth created in the United States went to the top 1% of the people. In 1950, the United States was less unequal than the European capitalist countries. Today, we are more unequal than they are by the usual Gini coefficient measuring that people in economics use. The second remarkable thing about capitalism, besides generating extraordinary inequality, is that capitalism has always been extraordinarily unstable. There's an agency of the US government you might want to take a look at called the National Bureau of Economic Research, NBER, and it does, among its other activities, keep a kind of track of the ups and downs of capitalism, this instability that expresses itself as crashes, depressions, recessions, downturns, collapses. You notice we have a lot of words for this phenomena because capitalism always keeps it right in front of us. And then there are the other sides of the coin, for example, on inflation. And some of you may know that our latest number indicates that we're currently at an inflationary rate of around 8% in the American economy, which is the highest it's been for 30 or 40 years. This instability works roughly as follows. Every 4 to 7 years, that's the average, we have a crash of one kind or another. Sometimes they don't last all that long, a matter of months, and they don't cut that deep. But at other times, they last very long and they cut very deep. On average, every 4 to 7 years, wherever capitalism has landed. Capitalists have been very creative, including many economists, trying to figure out how to prevent this, how to stop it, how to overcome it. They have failed for 300 years to do that, which is why, for example, in this new century, we have already had, in our 21 years of a new century, 3 crashes. The dot-com crash in early 2000, the subprime mortgage crash in 2008, and the COVID-19 crash in 2020, 2021. 21 years, 3 crashes, every 7 years, right on schedule. That's the average. And what that means is that every 4 to 7 years, typically, millions of people are suddenly thrown out of work. Not because of anything they did. Their work is just as productive as it was the week or the month or the year earlier. Not because people need the output any less than they needed it before, but because the way the system works leads to a sequence of behaviors that produces this instability. If you lived with a roommate as unstable as capitalism, you would have moved out years ago. But you haven't, because here we are talking about it. And then there's another one. I could go on for a long time, but I'm trying to focus on the major flaws of this system. Ecological sustainability. The remarkable thing about capitalism is that it says to every employer, your number one task is to make money. Profit is your bottom line. If you get your MBA at a business school, you will have to listen 100 times, if not more, to that point being made. Go out there and pay the least you can for the workers you hire. Pay the least you can for the inputs you buy. Charge the most you can for the output you sell. Because the difference between your costs and your revenues is what you walk away with. And your job as an employer, your place in the corporation, will be enhanced if you're good at the profit making, and it won't be so good for you if you're not. This way of organizing production means that you're not all that careful about what you do to Mother Nature, because it doesn't figure in to your cost and revenue calculations. Ecological concerns come in, if they come in at all, as an external, extraneous pressure on you, perhaps from young people concerned about getting polluted and sick. Capitalism hasn't done a real good job of dealing with ecological problems, which is why we face the ecological catastrophes that surround us at every turn. But as you can see, as I begin to pile up the problems and the flaws and the difficulties, that these may come to you as something of a surprise. Maybe it come to you as something of a shock. I don't know. I'd have to know you better. but I can tell you that they are not the stuff of the vast bulk of what you hear about capitalism, and you've probably noticed that. So let me tell you my own experience with this that may help before I get to what the alternative to capitalism would look like. I was born in Ohio. I've lived and worked all my life in the United States as a professor of economics. When I went to school, my professors were all, and I went to school as an undergraduate and then a graduate student for a total of 10 years, 20 semesters straight through without an interruption, undergraduate and graduate. During that time, in 19 of my 20 semesters, I was not given one piece of literature that was critical of capitalism. I did have one professor, one semester out of 20, who was the exception, who did give me something critical to read. But the other 19 didn't. It is a fair description of the other 19, some of whom were very good teachers, some of whom were poor, like usual. But it is fair to say of all of them that they were cheerleaders for capitalism. They told me over and over again how efficient it was, how remarkable was the economic growth it had enabled, etc., etc. When I raised questions, as I began to, that had a critical tilt, I could see in the faces of my teachers fear. Not so much upset, just plain fear. They didn't want to go there. And since I liked many of my teachers, I didn't want to make life difficult for them, so I got the message. And I stopped asking questions because I didn't want to wreck their day or their week or maybe even their career by pushing. So I went and I searched out the literature of criticism of capitalism on my own. And there's plenty of it. Turns out there was this guy, came after Adam Smith had opened up the celebration of capitalism. There was this guy, Karl Marx, who was a critic. And not only did he write very well from his base in London, where he did most of his mature economic analysis, but he spawned an enormous literature all over the world ever since, about 150 years worth, as I speak to you, of this kind of critical literature. So if you're interested, no shortage of it at all. Starting in the 19th century, as capitalism really began to establish itself, there began, as I've said to you, to be the critics all over the place. And they wrote music and they wrote literature and they developed political parties and labor unions and all kinds of institutions that were critical of capitalism. In the 20th century, the critics took another step. They were able to take political power in several parts of the world. Russia in 1917, China in 1949, Cuba in 1959, and so on. And in those societies, the critics of capitalism began to make experiments. How could you build a society that was different from, better than capitalism? In other words, the challenge of a critic. Okay, you've made your criticisms. Now let's see what you can do. But of course, the early experiments in what they came to call socialism had all the problems of early experiments in everything. If you ever have a chance to study the emergence of capitalism in Europe out of feudalism, you will discover that there were lots of experiments. Some lasted a few months, some lasted a few years. Many of them fell apart before they figured out, sort of trial and error, how to create the conditions that would allow capitalism to become the global system it is today. And in the same way, the socialist experiments of the 20th century are fueling a different approach using what was learned, what you should do, what you shouldn't do from the early experiments in the 20th century. And so the 21st will have a socialism already looking significantly different in important ways from what preceded it in the 20th. So in the time I have left, I'd like to devote a little bit to what the alternative looks like if your ideological or theoretical approach to capitalism enables you to ask the question, is there a criticism that we need to make here? And can the criticism go to the point of questioning the system itself, not this or that detail of it? Okay, I think there are. I think there are ways to specify what we could do, what we should do, in order to have a system that works better than capitalism in general, or if you like, US capitalism in particular. And I want to divide them between macro and micro, the system as a whole and the enterprise, the workplace. First, the system as a whole. When capitalism has an economic downturn of the sort I've mentioned to you already, and for example, of the sort that we've had in this century 3 times now, it is remarkable that we allow tens of millions of people to be thrown out of work. It's extraordinary. We need those people to be working. There's plenty to be done. Poverty to be eradicated, schools to be made adequate, ecological damage to be undone. We've got all the work we could possibly mention. And yet we throw people out of work, people who do not want to be out of work, who are upset about being out of work, whose problems of mental difficulty, alcoholism, child abuse all go up with unemployment, not even to speak of the loss of self-esteem, the damage to your skills, the strains on every relationship you have. So it's clear to me that unemployment, even when it isn't in the millions, but to take the most recent case, 2020, it was in the tens of millions. In case you're not familiar, we had over 80 million Americans out of work for some period of time over the last 2 years. That's more than half the labor force of this country was out of work. Consuming, they didn't all die, you know, consuming but not producing. They didn't want to be in that situation. Their savings, their family life, everything suffered because of it. Seems to me it'd be easy to come up with explanations about the ways we could have done better than throwing those millions of people out of work. But I don't really want to dwell on the big picture. I think you can figure that one out yourself. What I would like to close with is to talk about what socialists have figured out is the kind of alternative to capitalism that is, in a sense, the lesson learned from everything I've said to you. And that has to do with the workplace, the job, the enterprise, the place many of you are now aiming toward when you complete your education. And here's an alternative to the capitalist system you might want to think about. That many of the problems, the inequality, the instability, the whole way of conducting life under capitalism has a kind of origin, a kind of core place it comes from in the workplace. In your workplace, you have the following, as I said to you at the beginning, an extraordinarily undemocratic arrangement. A tiny group of people, the owner of the enterprise, the partners who run the enterprise, the board of directors if the enterprise is organized as a corporation. Board of directors, in case you're not familiar, typically has 10 to 20 people. They have all the power. They decide what will be produced. They decide how it will be produced, that is, what technology will be used. They decide where it will be produced, and they decide what will be done with the output when it is produced. They make all the key enterprise decisions. The vast majority of employees, and this may come as a shock, but I'll have to say it, that includes most of you. You will have to live with the decisions that tiny group makes. If they move production to China, your job is gone. If they choose a profitable technology that pollutes the air, you'll be breathing it. Or, of course, you can quit and go have the same relationship with some other employer who will run you through the same arrangement. So here's the socialist alternative. It is very simple. It is to democratize the enterprise. There it is. Change the organization of enterprise so that it is democratic. All the workers together, one worker, one vote, decide together democratically what will be produced, how it will be produced, where it will be produced, and what is done with the output that, after all of them helped to create by their labor. Imagine with me for a moment if the proposition came up, close the office, close the factory, move to China, and it were democratically decided, it wouldn't happen. Imagine with me if you were deciding at the end of the year who gets paid how much money this year. Would you give an overwhelming amount of money to 3 or 4 executives at the top while the average person can't pay for their kids' college? Not likely. The world would be a radically different place. And how remarkable is it in a society that says it's committed to democracy, that it has never had democracy in the workplace, where most adults spend most of their lives. It has been excluded from the workplace, with a few exceptions. They're called worker co-ops, and they are growing all over the world precisely out of the logic similar to what I've tried to present to you today. last point, then I'll stop. If you are interested, there is, as I've mentioned, an enormous literature of criticism of capitalism. You will not have heard about it much here. And I have to finish by explaining to you why that is. Because the criticisms aren't good? No, sir, not at all. They're excellent. They're every bit as good on the critical side as the defenses of capitalism that have been produced by the best defenders of them as well. Fear is what motivates the lopsided celebration in this country. And that comes out of mostly the Cold War. From 1945 almost to the present. Here in the United States, the dominant story has been capitalism US versus socialism. Used to be the USSR, now it's more the People's Republic of China. And in that kind of Cold War, it became necessary for everybody to salute the right side and condemn the other one. And in that environment, giving a fair shake to the critics proved to be more than the American educational system could allow. And so most of it, present company, of course, accepted, but most of it has been so lopsided that it is fairly embarrassing. You'll see that once you take a look at the critical literature and understand what it is that you have been denied. I'll close with a metaphor. Imagine you had an assignment in a class and the teacher said, I want you to go up to the end of the block here. There's an interesting family, a mother, a father, 2 children. And one of the 2 children thinks that they're so lucky to have been born into that family. It's a great family. They've gotten nurtured in all the ways they hoped for. But you're also told that the other child thinks that that family that they were born into was a psychological basket case. And you had to write a paper. And so you trudged up the street to that house and you knocked on the door. So here's the question. Would you talk to only one of the children, either one, and write your paper? Or would you think it was appropriate for you, if you're going to write a paper about this family as a unit, that you speak to both of the children and then draw whatever conclusions your mind brings you to? I think most of you would understand the point of the story. If you want to understand capitalism and you grasp that you live in a society that for most of the last century has been afraid to do what I just said, then maybe you'll have, the intellectual discipline to engage with the criticism, to have teachers like the one you have here who know about that and can guide you in that, so you can expose yourself to that kind of thinking, and then, of course, draw your own conclusion. I can assure you, you'll be the better thinker about the world you live in if you engage in that activity than if you don't. And if you're wondering where I went to school, just ask me, I'll be glad to tell you. So let me stop there and respond to any comments, questions that any of you might have.
Thank you so much. So on the second day of class, I had them come in, I gave them a blue book, and I posed a series of questions. The first was, what is capitalism? And the second was, what is a capitalist? And did I say to you, I think maybe the third was, are you a capitalist? And then I had a few other questions. Fascinating responses. So because the responses were so interesting, we started asking each of our guests when they join us. At the very first question we ask is of them, are you a capitalist? So I'm asking them. And it's the funniest, this is the right. We've gotten incredible answers even from our guests. I have a feeling I know what you're going to say, but I can't not ask the question.
Fine. The answer is real simple. I'm not.
Because?
Well, in my case, my parents were immigrants here to the United States. My father was French, my mother was German. They had absolutely no money. So for me, to be a capitalist means you have to have some capital, and I didn't have any. And so my parents didn't have any. And that kind of tilted me away from the aspiration to become that before I knew what it was. But then as I grew up and looked around me, it became clear to me that I was on some kind of other side. I didn't know exactly what that other side meant. That took a while. But I knew that somehow something was terribly amiss. And slowly over time, it became clear to me what that was. So, yeah, no, I'm not a capitalist. I have no desire to become one. I did go to school with people who were overwhelmingly the children of capitalists, and quite big ones, as it happens. And that did teach me an important lesson, which was that it doesn't make you happier, it doesn't make you more productive, it really doesn't do much for you. One of the few things you can say about the children of capitalists is that they had learned, which I have too, that it is better to have money than not to.
Well, this is very interesting. You gave an answer that is different from what I thought you were going to say. So hold on. Yeah, let me put it this way. Can you be very, very well paid and rich and not be a capitalist?
Yeah, there are people who are very well paid and get rich and who are not capitalists. There aren't all that many of them, socially speaking, but yes, sure you can.
So this is so interesting, Rick, because Matthew Forstater was our first guest, and you know Forstater, yes?
Yes.
Matt said, no, I am not a capitalist because I do not own the means of production, right? And I don't have the ability to fire workers and so forth. And that's what I thought you were going to say. So, but if we think in terms of money and having a lot of money, like a wealthy Major League Baseball player that doesn't have any employees, but has a multi-million-dollar contract, do you consider that person a capitalist?
No.
Okay.
For me, you know, I can be real clear. For me, to be a capitalist means you are in a certain relationship to other people. That's a separate matter from how much money you have in your bank account. There is a relationship between them. Typically, if you're an employer, the chances that you'll have a fat bank account are better than if you're an employee, for all the reasons that everybody can understand. But no, whether or not you're a capitalist has to do with the relationship that you are engaged in with the other people in your community.
That's what I knew That's what I knew of you. So right now we're going to have a delay to the start of the Major League Baseball season.
I would just
not because the baseball players don't want to go to work and play ball, but because the owners are not allowing them to reach a deal that will allow the season to start on time. So it's a very good
I
example.
thought it was funny. The owners are like, you're making us have to cancel games. Even though the players were like, we want the games, you're canceling them.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to open it up because I know that there are a lot of questions for you. So let's see who wants to start. And I'm going to go ahead in the back. Okay, you may sure come to the front.
My question is, because it seems like you were talking about how like basically any business owner or someone who has employees is kind of chasing profit. What is your opinion on nonprofits? Because the restaurant I work at is actually a nonprofit, and the owner said that he left. He stopped working with nonprofits and for nonprofits because he was, working with them and then watching the CEOs take off in their helicopter. So it seems like at a point, even if it is a nonprofit, there's still something going on with the top tier people in that situation.
Sure. I'll answer your question, but actually before it, is it conceivable that you have a business that has no profit? Well, depending a little bit on how you define profit, and just as a footnote, there's a long literature in economics debating on exactly how you define profit, how you measure it, and so on. But using the common sense kind of notion, there's no problem in having a nonprofit organization, because that would mean, for example, like a worker co-op, you divide up whatever the net revenue is, you subtract your costs from the revenue of whatever it is you make, that leaves you with a profit, and you divide it up among the people who work there in some manner that you have democratically arrived at as a reasonable way to do it. And then there would be no leftover, no profit after that. There's no problem. That exists. That has always existed. There have always been people who've wanted to interact with one another in that kind of a way, rather than in the top-down hierarchical capitalist way. But having said that, mostly nonprofit in our society is a mistake. It's a game. You've been taken in by an advertising ploy that you kind of shouldn't have been. And let me give you an example. Yale University is a nonprofit institution. What in the world does that mean? Does it mean that their revenues are not larger than their costs? No, it does not mean that. The revenues of Yale on an average year over the last 40 years have been tens of millions of dollars greater than their costs. So they've always had a profit. What happened was, under the laws of the United States, Yale did something fairly common. It declared itself to be an educational institution, which I suppose many of you imagine, wrongly by the way, that it is, but they call themselves an educational institution. Why? Because that gives you what's called tax exemption. They are a tax-free entity. They don't pay taxes. In other words, if they get interest on a loan, they don't pay income tax on that interest. If they get a dividend from owning a share of stock, they don't pay an income tax. The property they own, Yale is located in New Haven, Connecticut. It has about 200 buildings in that city. It's the largest employer, the largest landowner. It is the big cheese in that city, okay? It doesn't pay any property tax on the vast majority of those buildings because it's an educational institution. But over the years, the law which gave them that exemption began to be a political problem. Why? Because the people of New Haven, by the way, New Haven is one of the 10 poorest cities in the United States. So try to understand Yale, New Haven. I lived there for 30 years. I do know what I'm talking about, and I went to school at Yale, so I know it from both sides. So this poor city delivers services to the fourth richest university in the world. The citizens of this poor city pay the salaries of the cops, of the firefighters, of the street cleaners, of all the services that are brought to Yale, which is the richest citizen in the community, are paid for by the poor ones. If you were honest, you'd call this what it was: Robin Hood in reverse. You steal from the poor to enhance the rich. And so this got Yale into trouble, because the people in the town began to say, wait a minute, we pay taxes to deliver free services to the richest entity amongst us. And Yale therefore said, no, we're not tax exempt. We are, ready, here we go, not for profit. Sounds much better, but that's all it means. It means you are not making a profit subject to taxation. It doesn't mean, and it never meant that legally, that you don't make a profit. That's not relevant. The law simply says you don't pay a tax on income you earn, period. And that's what's enjoyed by all of these super rich American universities, of which I am a graduate. These institutions are ripoffs. They always have been. By the way, the law that gave Yale tax exemption was passed in the 17th century when Yale was a college designed to train Protestant ministers who would minister to Protestant parishes in the immediate surrounding area. They've used that law all the way to this moment to deprive that city of the taxes that would otherwise make it not only not the poorest city, but a model city for this country. All of that is denied. But of course, if you go to Yale, you will hear not one word about all of this, because it's not the kind of thing Yale would like you to be aware of.
All right, so Professor Wolff also has a history degree from Harvard. Let's not get him started on Harvard because we want to make sure. Let me get another. Did you have a hand up? No, I know you did. Okay, go ahead.
Just leading up to this meeting, we read your paper on the ideological state apparatus. I wanted to know that since you finished writing that paper and the internet has evolved and become a way more crucial part of our lives and a way more corporatized part of our lives, has your opinion on the ideological state apparatus changed? And do you feel more pessimistic or optimistic about the future of that?
I'm sorry, the sound quality, not your fault, but it's not coming through. Can
So
you?
He's asking about that paper that I told you that I had them read on the ideology paper. And in that paper, you talk about the ideological state apparatus and the various ways through which we reinforce the ideologies of capitalism. And he's saying, since you wrote that paper, the internet and social media, there's been all this explosion and corporatization through social media channels, Facebook and Google and the rest of it, algorithms that, decide what images you see, what articles you're directed to when you do a search for something, what matches it brings up and so forth. And he's asking how that might does that make you more optimistic or pessimistic about how to find the Achilles heel, I think, in, undermining ideologies that support a system that you are critical of?
Yeah, okay. Now I get it. Thanks for clarifying that. I think I only feel more strongly, to be honest with you, about these things than I did when I wrote that. One of the central ideas there is, in my mind, even more applicable or stronger than it was then. And that is the very careful cultivation, especially in the United States, but not only here, but especially here, the enormous effort that goes into cultivating a remarkable idea. And the idea goes like this: work is inherently negative. Work is a drag. Work is a burden. Work is let's use economics for those of you who study it. Work is a disutility. In other words, it's the opposite of a utility. It's opposite of useful or desirable or exciting or fulfilling. It is a drag. And the compensation that you as a person get for this drag that you have to do, this work, is you get to go to the mall. You get money, so that the consumption is the compensation for the work. By the way, in formal economics, that's how it's taught. Labor is a disutility. Consumption is what gives you utility. And here's the irony. The best days of 5 out of 7 days of the week, You're at work if you're an adult. You get ready in the morning to go to work and you brush your teeth and you get on the subway or wherever you go and you go to work and you give it all for 8 hours or more. Then you come home, recover, recoup, barely get ready, and you got to do it again. If you're not happy, if you want a full life, why wouldn't you be focused on, here we go, making the job the learning experience, the joyful experience, the desirable experience? Why are you living in a culture that basically says, submit when you go to work, resign yourself? You're going to be dictated to, you're going to be told what to do, you're going to be bored, you're going to be distracted, but it's okay. Because when it's over, or maybe if you're too tired, not then, but on the weekend, you can go to the mall and fill up your garage with boxes and boxes of things you vaguely remember enjoying when you bought them. It is a stultification of human life. It is telling you in ways that are really no different from how a medieval peasant was told, you toil and you toil and you toil. The only problem was the peasant didn't have a mall he couldn't go to. You get to go to the mall. You get to consume and to look for your satisfactions in objects rather than in the relationships that you spend most of your adult life in. My fear is that social media enhance that negativity, but my hope is that they also allow for the kinds of communication that will let people, once they figure out that this deal they've been given is not the necessary one. And that's part of why socialism in the 21st century is focused on worker co-ops, on recasting the whole life of what a workplace is, because that speaks to a lot of the upset and the sense of isolation and loneliness that is part of capitalism in its current situation.
Go ahead.
So I remember we watched the debate between you and Epstein. So
Right.
I remember you saying that socialism was born out of capitalism. And you say capitalism here today is born from other systems, evolved over time, therefore it'll eventually die. So do you think if socialism was implemented, it would also eventually fail?
Absolutely. There's no, again, the burden seems to me to be on anyone who believes otherwise. Every other system we've had displays that pattern: birth, evolution, death. And my expectation would be that the people who are frightened by that, who need to hold on to the idea that capitalism is somehow the end of history, are desperate about what it is that's coming, which is the end of this system. But yes, I think it implies that we would expect the same of whatever comes next, whatever name it has, that it will display that same pattern. You know, it's part of the more general philosophical notion that the only thing that doesn't change is the process of change itself.
With the eventual stated goal of making the worker cooperative the dominant means of organization of the workplace, how does the issue of expertise get addressed? Where you have a bunch of workers cooperating to make big decisions on what the organization does, what its goals are, what its next moves are. But there's a good chance that many of those workers, if not the vast majority, don't have specific training on the means by which you make educated decisions. So how does that get addressed? Is there going to be in a worker cooperative that's perfectly democratic? Will some people influence the others because they happen to have that certain expertise? How do you address that kind of imbalance, information imbalance?
I think in the way that every democratic society has had to do. You'd have everybody sit down and talk it through. look, these people have had this years of education. These people have had this amount of experience. They've learned things. We have to take into account that if we have them doing this activity, we take advantage of all of those accumulated knowledges, let's call it for lack of a better term. And that's as it should be. That should be democratically decided. Okay, but there has to then also be some supervision. We have to be careful that the extra knowledge is not abused for other ends other than being better at some task than a person without that knowledge. And how do you institutionalize that kind of democratic control, let's say, over that? But it's the same question. If you look at the actual worker co-ops around the world, you'll see that they've all practically solved that problem in various ways. Some of them give more money, for example. If you've had more education, then you get a higher share of the income at the end of the production process. If you went to a lot of schooling, well, then you had to experience what that meant, and that gave you a certain standing in the worker co-op to have a bit more say about a certain kind of decision than a person who didn't have that in their history. And the community works that out, as by the way, it always has throughout human history, worked that kind of problem out. You know, let me be blunt. We used to have kings and queens. We used to live in societies where it was thought that the king was in constant contact with God and was God's agent on earth. And that to question what the king told us would be to question who he was in touch with, which you really wouldn't want to do given your future in that very hot place you might otherwise have to go to. And then at a certain point, we approached our kings and we separated their heads from the rest of their bodies, and they were gone. And they had told us for centuries before that if you get rid of the king, society will crumble. You'll have no director. You'll have no one with the specialized knowledge that comes from having lunch every Thursday with God. And so it'll disappear. Well, we got rid of the kings and nothing happened that we have to worry about. Well, did the kings disappear? I don't think so. They fooled us. They went, changed their name, and hid. They're now called CEOs. They exist inside corporations where they function like kings with nearly absolute authority, giving themselves ridiculous amounts of money while the rest of the society can't take care of basic functions. We got the same problem. We got to get rid of the kings, even when they have cleverly redisguised and rebranded themselves. That's what the worker co-op version of socialism is about.
Go ahead.
I had a question about the worker co-op model, because if you have worker-directed enterprises, but you maintain like the profit motive and commodity production continues as is and still intact, I think because people, like when people join a worker cooperative, right, every single person who's working has a share, has a vote, right? If the business expands, you need to hire more people, right? Well, then your share of the vote decreases, your share of the profit decreases. I think like a really big example of this is like Mondragon in Spain. Has recently they started like hiring a bunch of people as contractors who don't have the ability to vote, who are essentially just regular wage laborers, right? And how do you avoid that backsliding if you maintain a profit motive and want to work for?
Good. Just a correction. Mondragon has always had a division between those workers that are members of the co-op, as they call it, and those workers that are either hired or on a contract in the way you specify. That is not new. They've struggled with that. They have enormous debates inside. For those of you that are not familiar, Mondragon is probably the world's largest and most successful worker co-op. It's actually a family of about 150, 200 co-ops. It's the 7th or 8th largest corporation in all of Spain, extremely successful. It grew from 6 workers who started it in 1956 in a little town in the north of Spain called Mondragon, And it now has over 100,000 workers in it. And it's a remarkable success story. It has its own laboratories where it partners with two American corporations that pay Mondragon so that their scientists can work alongside the scientists of the worker co-op. The two American corporations you might like to know are Microsoft and General Motors. In any case, when you hire another worker, to use your example, whether you're a capitalist or not, the usual motivation is the assumption that by hiring another worker, you get enough extra output that the income of the other workers to whom you're adding one will not go down. In other words, that's part of the decision making when you do that. But let me get to the deeper question, the profit mode, the drive of every corporation to make a profit. That's the competitive system of capitalism. That's not necessary. Most of human history, people produced goods and services, and there was no profit motive. There was no competition in the sense that capitalists face it. The capitalist always had the problem, if you don't offer the commodity at the lowest price, your competitor will, and then the customers will go to your competitor and you'll be out of business. So to survive, you have to basically beat your competitor at what your competitor is trying to beat you at. That's one way of arranging things. But there's no need to do that. You could have an arrangement in which the market, whatever quantity of goods there was that was demanded, was parceled out among a handful of firms. Each of you take 1/6 of this market, you produce for that. You are not in a competitive situation. If one of you comes up with a cheaper or better way, we'll reward you in this way. Maybe then we don't need as many firms making that because you've come up with a new way. All right, we will have a system where the people who are excess are told you're not needed in this line of work. Here's 6 other areas that are growing. Pick whichever one you want. You will not suffer a loss of income. You will make a transition from the one activity you used to do to the new one you're going to go into. And all of that can be managed, has been managed. We know how to do that. With computers, it's even easier than it was before. Think of it this way. Markets have been used, as I told you earlier, by slave systems, by feudal systems, by capitalist systems. And in each case, markets have to be adjusted and managed in order that the system survive, because the relationship between the producer and the consumer on the one hand and the market is a contradictory one. I'll give you the example that you all are familiar with. In a capitalist system, if you leave the system to itself, you produce a class of impoverished workers that threaten the system. And so what you do is you stop using the market. This is done by passing a law which says there is a minimum wage. And if you're an employer who pays less than the minimum, we're going to arrest you and put you in jail, which is the law in this country. We had to do that because the alternative was to have a market that was dysfunctional to the capitalist class. So they had to make the accommodation. And they do that all the time. There are caps on interest rates. There are rules about what you can and cannot do. And if you wanted a system of worker co-ops, you would have to arrange that if you use markets, you don't have to, but if you do, then the markets have to be regulated and controlled to reproduce the system that they coexist with, or else that you risk they're disrupting it.
Should we say thank you one more time? So, thank you so much again for joining us. I'll send you a note.
All right, my pleasure. I hope people found it of interest.
They did.
For sure.
I assure you. Thanks
All right.
very much. Okay,
Bye-bye.
bye-bye. Have a good break. Be safe.
Thank you.
Thank you.